architecture and planning. And I'm Miriam Fitzpatrick, and I'm trained as an architect. I lecture in urban design, and I dabble in some history of planning. And I'm delighted today to be joined with two colleagues who I have worked with in various capacities. Our first speaker will be Derry O'Connell, and Derry and I have taught urban design together at UCD. And our second speaker will be Nicola Matthews, and Nicola and I have worked on various heritage projects together. So we're among friends and among town lovers as well here. So I'll give you a little bit of background on Derry, then you'll speak for 10 to plus or minus a few minutes, and then I'll introduce Nicola, if that makes sense. So Derry is an architect and a planner and adjunct assistant professor at UCD, and he spent 2/3 of his career in architectural practice and 1/3 in academia, and I'm guessing now you can enjoy the combination of both as adjunct professor. He worked with the great architect Liam McCormack and Partners, and with Dún Laoghaire Corporation and with Dublin Corporation, and he was the head of urban design and planning with the MBA, which I think is part of his talk today. He is qualified in urban planning and in urban design and in architecture, and now has completed a PhD in urban morphology at the Bartlett at University College London. His earlier publication includes Tending the City, and we look forward to his next few volumes on towns on the basis of his recent work on morphology. So welcome, Derry. You can begin. You go that way.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm going to talk, or at least refer to, the years before the Atlas, or life before the Atlas, as a way of illustrating just how important the Atlas is, how we worked without it, and then moving into how we work with it. When the urban tax incentives were introduced in the 1980s for urban renewal, the Department of the Environment set up the Urban Design Unit under the National Building Agency, drawing together a number of architects who would act as a consultancy for local authorities who did not have experience in urban design. And our remit really was to prepare or offer ourselves available to prepare plans for small towns to avail of the urban tax incentives. I'm going to talk mainly about Sligo because we did quite a number of schemes in Sligo, and one of them was for the area south of the Garvogue River, the area on the sort of curved plot here between O'Connell Street, or what was then Knox Street, and Castle Street. Somebody kindly placed this here today to illustrate the same block there. Very kind, thank you. The area is surrounded by absolutely perfect architecture. The buildings in all of the surrounding streets were untouchable really from an architectural point of view, and the surrounding streets were also very lively. So there was a very delicate environment there that could not be interfered with. And we were asked really, our brief was to turn the town around to face the river. But we had to be very careful doing that because of this circumstance. There's a typical view of building in the surrounding streets in Castle Street. So a very good urban substance, which we didn't interfere with. And that's a view of the site from the other side. There's very little that talks to you architecturally from that, but within it there is quite a complex and very interesting morphology, which we noted as something that we should explore and certainly work with in the making of any urban design scheme which would address the waterfront. but the area had an extremely complex plot framework. Very difficult to know what any of these plots were doing and how they related to the general structure or the morphological structure of the area. And I just move quickly to the Roke map of Dublin, because I think this James Street map shows very interestingly or very clearly Conson's, or MRG Conson's principles on the morphological region, that the region that supports the street is not just about the space of the street, nor the buildings which define it, but you go right into the plots. It's back to the plots that support those buildings which support the street. So in our view, the street runs from the tail seam of one plot to the tail seam of the other, right across. And this was a principle we had to be very careful of in the Sligo case, because it was difficult to recognize what plots supported the surrounding streets and how we could tamper with, if I use the phrase, that block, which was substantially of derelict buildings facing the river, without interfering with the support space for the surrounding streets. We carried out extensive, or the methodology we arrived at was carrying out extensive plot-by-plot interviews with all of the plot owners and stakeholders as to where their plots came from, what they were doing with them, what their intentions were, and then looking at plot combinations that might work to facilitate any development. And we spent a long time doing this. Sligo Corporation were perfectly, or the perfect clients in facilitating this. They realized that this had to be done in order to come with the right solution. And in fact, that's why the area was designated, in order to encourage some thought which had not been there for many years as the area became derelict. If we had had the map at that stage, everything would have been perfect, because the map illustrates, the map came 10 years later. The map now illustrates all of the things we would want to have known about that site. Where exactly the areas were that needed delicate treatment. For example, the left-hand section, or western section of the block, is a very shallow plot depth, but supporting a very strong street. Whereas on the south side, certainly on the southeast, the existing plot depth is less important. Now the map of 1835, the map number 2 from the Atlas, is a very important moment in the development of the block, because it represents that pre-commercial period when the town was made or formed, but had not yet begun to accept much larger scale uses, or had not begun to, in other words, interfere with the major constituents that made this block. But you can see that the map shows the area on the east, with lots of long green gardens running down to the river, which was less important, nothing there originally. That block of square buildings in the middle, which has very little connection with the street. It was a set of derelict breweries. And then the very delicate section on the west, where interference had to be minimal. Anyway, we came up with a scheme. We came up with an urban design scheme, which was adopted by the corporation, built, and it now operates as a very successful waterfront. I'm sure today that everybody is sitting in the sun there drinking coffee. They sometimes are, anyway. We had completed the brief, but with certain delicate sections around the edge, which had to be the way they were because of the obligation to serve the block and the way in which it served both the waterfront and the street behind. The scheme won quite a number of awards in Ireland and internationally, mainly because of the methodology we had employed, that of going surgically plot by plot in determining how the town should multiply, or how the town should increase. and we won some awards for the architecture as well. But that's not, I don't want to talk about the scheme that's done and dusted and working. It's more about the knowledge that we had to have to get the right scheme in there. And I'd just like to talk about two things which the Atlas does for us as urban designers. In smaller towns, the earliest OS maps tend to show buildings as a mass. They don't tend to carry the plot subdivisions through the buildings as party walls. So in a Consinian analysis, you can't actually see the building on the plot being the main formation element of the town in association with the streets. What the cartographers have done in creating the atlas is they have moved back the identifiable lines from the later Ordnance Survey maps with a certain degree of conjecture. We tried to do this many times as urban designers, but we were not confident. We're not historical geographers, we're not cartographers. And I know that some of the lines here are dotted, as they are in many of this series, but I would describe it as an informed conjecture of the cartographer, which certainly as urban designers we would have a lot of confidence in. So that's one thing that the maps do that are great, or the Atlas series does, which is of great benefit to us. And another thing refers to the topographical gazetteer, the information gathered around the making of the map. Remember that architects are very seldom paid for historical research. The client just wants the building, and as quickly as possible. And architects who try to be sensitive very often spend their own free time researching. One of the great things about the Atlas series and its gazetteers and the maps that it includes in the portfolio is that you have the confidence that everything that is relevant has been searched. And I include the map of Mullingar here, which incidentally was made back when we were already working on towns with the Urban Renewal Acts. Because this block north of the main street in Mullingar, modelled there on the left, has a very complex access system, very carefully designed, and there are maps which show early versions of it, but we know from those who have written the Mullingar essay that this block has been searched for two Forbes estate maps, which apparently describe the early stages of its design philosophy, but cannot be found. And it's concluded, I think, that they don't exist any longer. But as an architect, I could have spent months searching, but I know with confidence that the gazetteer and the included maps have gone as far as can be gone in order to provide the amount of information that's essential around these decisions. Now, I just want to speak briefly to finish about some work I've been doing on towns on the continent. I was based at the university in Eindhoven for a year, looking at the operational structure of small European towns. And of course, towns that were featured in the Atlas were very important here, because I was able to compare them with a common map type with those which I knew in Britain. But of course, when we step onto the continent, we are without the Ordnance Survey, which I think is one of the great gifts that we have here in Ireland and in the UK system. One has to look beyond such a regular entity to find maps that are accurate going back far enough. The Historic Atlas series has taken some of those together in a format, but the format is not followed as religiously in a lot of other countries as it has been in Ireland. So the advantage of direct comparison is not there. But one of the towns that I loved working in particular, was Erkelenz, which is a little town just northwest of Cologne, southwest of Dusseldorf. Because Erkelenz is one of the earliest of the historic map series in Germany. Shows plots which display a great flexibility in the relationship, or that moment between medieval plots and the development of the standard 6-metre wide plot that now virtually inhabits all European towns of this size, because of structural limitations, because spanning distances of timbers for first floor determine this width which is suitable for shop front. In Erkelenz here, the map on the right is the map on the left, 1819. The map on the right is a 1951 post-war map, and you can see lots of vacant space, and you can trace decisions, for example, to reduce the amount of things that happen in the central area, and to extend the square size to incorporate various things. The little rat house there on the bottom right now stands alone. In earlier situations, it was engaged with other pieces of the central square. And then this is a little town in the Netherlands called Dongen, which is just east of Breda. And I love this set of maps on the left because they are the steam tram maps from the 1890s, 1900s. They run right into the 1920s. This is quite a late one. And you can see the little black dots along the street there. They are where the steam tram used to stop. So a colleague in the map department in the University of Utrecht has convinced me that these are the first really accurately reliable maps of Europe, and on the same standard as our Ordnance Survey. I don't know whether to believe that or not. I'm sure some cartographers can support me. And on the right then is a map of the 1970s. But I illustrate this because it explains some of the things that we look at in other towns and might compare them with towns in Ireland. If you look at the map on the right there, it's the interface really between the town centre there in red and the residential edge, or the inner edge of the residential area in the right. And it's a contested block. The town square, building up its supermarkets and Aldi's or whatever, wants car parking space. And the actual depth of the block is determined by probably an inner distributor road, which was inserted there on the right-hand side at an earlier stage when the actual needs of both of these use types was not fully calculated. So you get this conflict between uses, which could have been worked out differently had the block design or the position of the road anticipated the relationship between the historical needs of these two types. And I just take that example back to Ireland, because if you look here at some of the okay, right, just there, I'll stop at this one. Some of the towns in Mayo in particular, we have this structure where a parallel service route runs at the back of the street. And this proves extremely suitable nowadays to incorporate larger floor plate uses, which are a feature of the needs of smaller towns in order to survive, where the service route can now be used to serve the back of the smaller plots serving the street, as it always did at that dimension, while the outer space, the larger spaces, originally used for domestic farming, is now essentially redundant and suitable for things like large stores and car parks. And a number of towns in Mayo do this quite successfully, maybe not intentionally, but it quite successfully happens. Swinford is an example, Ballyhaunis, Charlestown, Ballahadreen. All of those have not yet been visited by the Atlas series. Indeed, if the Atlas series stands with its standard Map 2 as dating from around 1895, it might miss Charlestown altogether because Charlestown wasn't actually built until the 1940s. But anyway, that's another story. I just illustrate this to show that there's a tremendous amount of learning to be made to the advantage of urban designers in using the map comparison, both within Ireland and between Ireland and the historic series from other countries. Thank you very much.
Derry. You see, we're just warming up because Mayo is my town, so it's great to hear about that and really, really good. I love this discussion on dimensions, getting to that close detail. So our second speaker is Nicola Matthews, and she's a senior architect with the Built Heritage Division of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. And she's based in the Customs House, but she's also part of a European-wide group called the New European Bauhaus, and she is a lifelong friend in the world of heritage, planning towns, etc. And I will skip on to just say that you're going to be talking about the use of the collaborative town centre health check, and has been very active with the National Monuments Service and is about to publish a new guidance note on that. So I'm hoping you're going to tell us about that, Nicola. Thank you. Oh, we're going to see some lovely slides I didn't get to hear. There you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Good afternoon. I'm going to attempt to bring this together in the 10 minutes that have been allocated to me about Ainger Street, and I suppose, like Derry has stated, how the Historic Towns Atlas was a wonderful resource at the time for me as a conservation architect and as a conservation officer in Dublin City, and how it allowed us to unlock the cultural significance of Ainger Street, which is one of the first, it was known as the first planned suburb in Dublin, laid out in 1661. Not only did the Historic Towns Atlas allow us to get so much learning about this area of the city, it also allowed a really meaningful piece of collaboration which became known as the Ainger Street Study, which was a project initiated by Dublin City Architects, conservation team, and my good colleague Susan Rantry is here with me today, and some others online, potentially Oisin Kelly. And this was a project that was an action of Dublin City Council's public realm strategy. The research was carried out with Dublin Civic Trust, funded by both Dublin City Council and the Heritage Council, and it was a cross-departmental methodology that was used. So the Historic Towns Atlas brought together a group of people to look at this area known as the Ainger Estate, as I said, laid out by on land approximately 20 acres in 1661 by the first Baron of Ainger. And this is a series of maps by Nuala Burke that we knew of in City Council. And I suppose it describes beautifully how a place can change and how it can be layered. And really it was to try and understand what of that survived and what it meant today in terms of planning and development, and importantly, what was the cultural heritage that was left to the community for their benefit and well-being. And what the Historic Towns Atlas allowed us to do was to sort of immerse ourselves into this period in time in Dublin and think about what was happening. We knew the Duke of Ormond, James Butler, had become Viceroy of Ireland, and one of the first things that he'd done was set up the brick guilds. Susan Roundtree's work on that identified that there was a shortage of building materials, and that brick was needed to remake this medieval city. The circle I show is, to me, one of the interesting pieces of the sort of forensic work that we did on the mapping and the illustrations that are within the Town's Atlas. Is this moment of where the new state architecture collides with the medieval fabric, and we can see what the new state architecture is going to be in the city. I have an image there of Francis Ainger's brother George, who actually was the Viceroy in Bombay, and we know from work of others that there was a considerable trade between Bombay and money sent back to finance the development of the Ainger estate. So that was of great interest to us. Did that influence the overall architecture of the place and how it was laid out? And looking at wider images from the Historic Towns Atlas, one on Longford actually identified Ainger's house, first Baron's house, in actually Longford town itself, which was, I think, demolished, I think, in the 1980s. But you can see this unusual tower house at the top of the town. You can see it circled in, there. And the beautiful eaves detail of the brick cornicing, which we now know, high pitched roof, all features of early buildings. The bottom right image is from Surat in Bombay, which is where his brother would have been residing. So this was the lands that were granted in 1661 from Speed's map. You can see the area is juxtapositioned to Dublin Castle, and there are some structures present. The St. Peter's de Hill, number 29, is illustrated there in Speed's map, which we know was then subsequently replaced by a second St. Peter's church, which was part of the development of Ainger's lands. I think it dates from about 1685, and then it was then subsequently replaced. But what I wanted to sort of show was in the 1673 Bernard de Gaume map, there was some really important information. On the east side of the street, we could see very large building plots, and these puzzled us because when we compared those to the present day map, we weren't getting houses that fitted with this pattern of development. Also, I wanted to draw your attention to how little development had spread to the east, and the sort of surviving features of St. Stephen's Street following an earlier, I think, water course, and of course the formalisation of Stephen's Green just taking place at this time as well, but no, how to say, axial route cut to it. And I suppose our sense of this site was that it was raised and looking out towards the sea, and a good aspect for high-class housing, which was the brief of Ainger to provide housing for the citizens or the society of Dublin Castle when they returned in 1660s. So our work, as I say, was with a multidisciplinary team, and what we were trying to do was establish the facts and the cultural sites of significance that we knew had existed and were still recognisable in the area. And the 1610 to 1756 map was of super assistance in terms of identifying key features such as the churches, but also I should reference the wonderful ditch of the monastic enclosure, which had, I suppose, defined the route around the Ainger estate. And of course, it was this monastic settlement that was taken during Reformation times from the White Friars who had settled there from the 12th century. And it was this land that Ainger acquired and then laid out his estate on, and cut the Ainger Street through the middle of it, which was described as a 70-foot wide street, and aligned it with the medieval route then that went on down to the river to the north. These cultural sites that are marked were of interest because we had evidence of them in archaeological records, which we started to incorporate and add to the knowledge of the place. I have the figure written down here. A18, for instance, was a Methodist hall meeting house, which was identified in an archaeological dig. In more recent times, the Theatre Royal, which was designed, one of the last projects of Sir Edward Lovett Pearce, was discovered in the most recent development at D21. And indeed, part of the ditch emerged at the end of, at that junction between Ainger Street and George Street, appeared in the development of that corner site. So I suppose our look at this map really sort of led us to believe that we had an extraordinary cultural layer that still existed in some way, but yet hadn't been fully understood or widely communicated in planning and development, but also even in terms of people's awareness of it on the street itself. Other information taken from this map series was this wonderful image from the east by Thomas Bate, and you could see very much the context of the city and the importance of these church spires at the time, and the undulation and fall away to the sea. So what was the important findings of the Ainger Street project? I suppose what it allowed us to do was to add databases from the local authority, gathered from different departments, and to put them together and relate them to the historical information and cultural information that we had from the map series. And the big discovery was, by working with archaeology, planning files, the map, the atlas, that existed a house type that we had forgotten about, that we didn't know existed, the Ainger Street Mountains, which really very much had been, I suppose, signalled by that earlier historical map by de Gaume, but we had lost sight of it in the actual physical fabric of the street itself. And this slide helped, illustrated by Dublin Civic Trust's recent modelling of their own building, shows that morphology of an early building type with the type of roof that I showed you in Dublin Castle, of brick, high pitched roof, casement windows, evolving and being divided into smaller merchant houses, and then eventually being refaced and left in place as maybe 18th or 19th century fronted buildings. Extraordinary buildings in terms of the amount of timber and carpentry, and we realise now that this carpentry and joinery that is left in these buildings is of huge archaeological significance, and we've been building databases and information about the timbers and how they were used, construction, etc. Here's another example. This is possibly the house that the Duke of Ormond would have moved into had it been finished. As you know, he then moved elsewhere. But this was the scale and the importance of Ainger Street at this time. It doesn't look like this late medieval building in the streetscape, but embedded in it is an amount of fabric that we would see needs to be carefully thought about and planned for in any future development. And I suppose this is really the core of the matter, is that as a conservation officer or as a practitioner, it's an understanding of the place, but also the buildings within it are important to driving how they're going to be reused and repurposed in the future. And here, as I say, is illustrations from Flora Mitchell on the top left, and we could pick up these kind of key characteristics of gables and projecting annexes from the mapping and from the illustrations within the town's atlas. and read them in the physical fabric today, confirming our thoughts about the place. This is the work of Mesh architects on 9 Angel Street, and they give you an illustration of how it might have looked. You can see in the mapping that we picked up a route through the building, which was then evidenced in the opening up works of the building, that this route still was within the fabric of the building. I also circled an image on the actual map, and we wondered about that for a long time. And of course, checking the Historic Town Atlas, they confirmed that it was George I on his horse, signalling that this was a royal quarter. And of course, he moved from there eventually to outside the Mansion House, and then was subsequently relocated again. So, and then just to look at the mapping that came with this, as you can see, the physical form from the air is very evident still in the over aerial view, in the recreated Ordnance Survey map. And I suppose one of the really interesting parts that we found was that this knowledge of how different streets and timelines for how they were laid out confirmed sort of the character of these laneways and connections. And of course, you have the wonderful sort of axial route down to Stephen's Green, which was very much, you know, a change in the planning of the area from the medieval routes to sort of the more generous Renaissance thinking, which was the start of the change of the city and its development to the southeast. So what did we do with this? I mean, this is all wonderful information, but actually we converted it into real knowledge for the local authorities to work with. And I think this is the point of all of this work. This is what Town Centre First, you might have heard been spoken of, encouraging multidisciplinary collaboration within local authorities and building a framework in which everybody can understand what is significant, what the condition of it, what's vacant, what's derelict, and how we might actually plan for its future management and reuse for residential housing. So I think this project on Angel Street is a suggestion in that direction. I think it's a methodology that could be taken by the Collaborative Town Health Check and used to inform communities of what is in their presence and what they mightn't realise is there. And this is what our mapping looked like in terms of the analysis. Miriam is asking me to move along, so I just wanted to show you this. And then, as I say, the legacy, I mean, I suppose what we found was that mapping and informing people through walking routes, movies and all of that, there was such an amount of, I suppose, knock-on work from industry study, even to this day. As I say, it's now going to be incorporated in an early buildings publication as a methodology for people to think about. I'm sorry to be so rushed. Thank you.
Here. Now my job as chair is to address your questions, but I have, of course, a question to myself first, if I may. Both architects here engaging with historical geography, and I guess my question, will I start with you, Derry? You mentioned, you know, that when developers come and they land with big capital into any town or city in Ireland, their interest isn't in that tight grain that's already there, and there's no money paid for the history. So can I just ask you about that pushing back and how maybe the Historic Town Atlas helps in the pushback against the kind of oversized developments that somehow allow capital to grow? You know what I mean? So when new developments arrive in an Irish town, do they fit into the morphology that exists? Yeah?
Well, I think that the local authority is an intermediary here, and as Ciara explained this morning, if the local authority realises what it has there, then in the public good there will be sectors of the town that are declared surgical infill and other sectors that are open to broader scale development. And I think if that if that is clear to developers, well then we're okay. But I think that also there's a feeling that from developers at this stage that that the public look to something that has a connection with heritage in the town. It's very, very marketable, as is green market in the rural area. And I think that a lot of the areas of tighter urban grain are suitable for the sort of things that we like towns for. And I think if that's conveyed to developers, well then the public will buy into that, and do buy into it fairly quickly. That's one of the reasons why Temple Bar succeeded. You know, Temple Bar by Group 91 was underway at the same time as we were doing Rockwood Parade in Sligo. And it was really a rejection of the tabula rasa, where you take the town away and put what you want in, because we know that goes out of date in now 20 years. So it's an acceptance of this fact that surgical infill is what holds the town that you love, at the same time adds in components that are, you know, publicly acceptable or publicly enjoyable.
Nico's thoughts on that, maybe taking it to streetscapes, as you've described so eloquently there.
It's a complex area, and certainly the value of that work that we did within the local authority made for better planning decisions, but also the point that Derry's making, that everybody understood what was of importance. And I suppose really now, when we're faced with climate action and people wanting more sustainable ways of life, this understanding of the grain and character of the place and using it in a meaningful way, and this surgical intervention that Derry is talking about is the way that we will, I suppose, ultimately be able to live more sustainably and have more diverse ways of living, diverse typologies within towns. So it's a much more time-consuming approach, but I think if you're going to retain sense of place, it's a critical piece to do.
Well, I'm made more optimistic than I might be in my day-to-day experiences, so thank you. Do others have questions? Thank you. So we've one here and then one here. Thanks.
In the town I love so well, as James Joyce would put it, he had the same problem when he went through the streetscape of Dublin. Everything was disappearing before his eyes. So when architects build their buildings, right, do they give a time scale for when it might fall apart? So that, like, if you take a Dublin city, every 100 years, maybe 10% of its buildings will disappear. And over 500 years, Dublin city won't be the same as it was, well, when James Joyce was in Dublin, 1904, and he comes back in 1925, it's all changed. So do you have a time frame for how long a building will last, or are you just putting it up as you go along and just hope for the best?
I think it's an interesting question. What I will say is that I think what's extraordinary about some of our heritage buildings is that I don't suspect that they were put up with that idea in mind, but that they were built of such good materials that they have stood the test of time. And I think if you think about flexibility and diversity of use, they have demonstrated that they can actually do that. So it's one of the issues, I think, for modern day architecture, is that maybe it didn't have that long-term sustainability in it because they weren't maybe as flexible in their design in terms of their layouts and their heights and structures. But that is something that modern architects are much more aware of now, thinking long-term sustainability. I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, I would support that. But I think that Georgian buildings were built permanently. It was assumed they'd be there forever. The slates on the roof would be replaced, the parapet would be replaced, there would be small replacements, but they were generally built with the intention that they were being built permanently. Every architect hopes that his building will be there for, his or her building will be there for eternity anyway. But I think that the building for obsolescence is a very important question, because I think that's more determined by bank loans than anything else. You play the city like you play Monopoly. You say, I put an office block here, it will have a payback period in 20 years or whatever. My rent will pay for that, and then who knows, I'll sell the site. Whatever they want to put in on it later on really doesn't relate to permanence. There's no sense of permanence in place when you think of building a building for investment. And I think that's what leads the important question of building our city for obsolescence and taking a 20 or 30 year span. Most of the buildings being demolished in Dublin at the moment are buildings from the 70s, incidentally. It's just interesting.
Two additions to that, of course, is that maybe the Historic Town Atlas will move into this late 20th century because we have lost so much of that, and that's not currently captured by the map. And secondly, for any buildings now trying to think about our carbon take-up, I think every plan should be required to say, maybe as an urbanist, how could you convert your project? And how would it look in 50 years' time and 100 years' time? And that would be part of planning. That would have got rid of some huge mega blocks that can never be unlocked. You know, so just to pick up on your point. The second question is here.
Sorry, I have a question for Nicola, please. Were you surprised by the house under Tesco? If so, why? If not, why not? Thank you.
Well, I'm getting all the questions today. I wasn't surprised. No, I think we knew a lot more about that site, and that's, you know, I suppose the problem for, you know, it's the big development comes to town, and you're combating a whole lot of different agendas. Cultural heritage wouldn't be the only agenda in the city. There's other considerations. I don't make the, you know, there's a local authority that makes the final decision on it. So I think what you have is, you know, compromise to try and balance everything. There's a need for economic vitality, but I think there's also a balance that needs to, in general, take place in terms of both social value and cultural value in the city. It can't just be always economic-led. So I think we're a country that is pretty much in infancy, really, in conservation practice and how to organise ourselves. And I think we've come a long way in, you know, the 20 years from the legislation. So my attitude is that every project is one to learn from, and, you know, if there are things that we need to adjust on, that these are the things that are considered. Yeah.
Good question, good answer. Beth, did you have a question?
I did, but well, I had a comment, but Derry supplied what I was going to say.
Okay. So I'm just in the interest of time then, would that be all right that I need to wrap it up, even though there are so many questions that you're opening, and we'll have to have another session maybe in urban design to pick up on them. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to our panel, Derry and Nicola.